California, and I'm looking out here. I can't believe this is England.
It's all right, neither can we.
The story's not finished yet.
This is really impressive, I've got to say. It's really something. I'll apologize in advance. I'm getting over a cold. I may run and take a sip of tea here and try to recover my voice. So bear with me if that's a problem. I told my wife that I had been asked to come and see you and talk for about 30 minutes. And she looked at me and she said, well, you know, why would anyone really want to listen to you for 30 minutes? And why would anyone want to pay to listen to you for talk? The hanging implication there was I probably didn't know what I was talking about, and I'm old enough that maybe I don't remember everything anymore. But anyway, here I am, and I'll give it a try, and maybe I'll tell you something. As far as the part about actually paying to see me, I was thinking about it. We were in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and they have an underground tour of the city. You can see the old streets and the old sewer system. And I thought about it. We paid this guy to talk about shit for an hour. Anyway, I'll try to do better than that. The history of Rickenbacker really goes back into the 1920s. The company was founded in the 1930s, 1931 to be specific, but you have to look back into the 1920s to understand what was going on. At least in the US, and I presume here as well, vaudeville was the game. The vaudeville theaters, there were comedians, dancers, singers, and some rather large bands were being formed to support all of this. The non-electric Spanish guitar was introduced in the early 20s to those bands. But the problem was to the vaudeville guitarist, he couldn't be heard over the horns and all of the rest of the percussion and all of the other instruments. He just simply couldn't be heard. And one young vaudeville guitarist, George Beecham, tried all kinds of things to solve that problem. He wanted to be heard. He didn't want to be constantly overrun by the rest of the band. He wanted to be heard, so his first solution was to take a gramophone horn attached to his guitar and thereby amplify it somewhat. A little bit unwieldy. I think it must have been sort of like playing a tuba, but he tried that for a while. And then he had an idea and he went to a company and they came up with the idea of putting resonators on a guitar. This would be the Dobro company. And he started to work for them and became their designer, advisor, and probably a guinea pig for any of their new products. This worked moderately well. It was somewhat louder, if a little bit more raucous than a typical non-electric guitar. And he had this rough idea. He wasn't quite sure how to do it, but he had this rough idea that an electric guitar might be something that could be interesting. He didn't really quite know how to do it, but at that time, the Dobro company was stamping out zillions of instruments made out of metal. The bodies were metal, many of the necks were metal, and of course the resonator plates were all on aluminum. All of these parts were being made by a Swiss immigrant to the U.S., Adolf Rickenbacker. He He had come to the U.S. And was a young design engineer. He had some great ideas on how to produce different things. His first job coming into the U.S. was for the Hot Point Company, and at that time, all of the irons, electric irons that they were producing, had a wooden handle on them, and they were looking for something better. And Adolf was introduced by the company to a Dr. Bakeland. Dr. Bakeland had come up with the idea of various chemical composition to create phenolic, except that they didn't really know what to do with phenolic. They would put it together, they'd mix it up, and it would just kind of make a plastic mess. And Adolf looked at this and thought about it for a while and came up with the idea of having two opposing molds, and with some heat and pressure, maybe they could turn this terrible gooey mess into something actually useful. So perhaps Adolf's greatest claim to fame should be he was a father of injection molding. He came up with the idea of simply forcing that plastic in there and popping out parts like crazy. And his first actual product was the paper-like handles for irons. One of the big problems that they faced in production was that the plastic would stick inside the mold. They mold it, but they couldn't pop it out. So being the very creative guy that he was, he had them formulate the plastic with about 10% counter cleaning material, the kind of thing you might scour your sink with and whatever. So actually, the more plastic they put through the molds, the cleaner they got. So that gives you a little insight into the kind of creative thinking that Adolf did. Well, George Beecham was very fortunate to strike up a friendship with Adolf, or perhaps maybe it was Adolf's good fortune. He struck up a friendship, and George told him about the problem, creating more sound out of his guitar. And Adolf thought about it, and between the two of them, we came up with the idea of a pickup. The idea being that there's an electronic coil, a coil of copper wire, and a magnet, and the string vibrating in front of it disturbs the magnetic field. By this time, PA amplifiers were quite well known. They were used in all of the vaudeville acts, so there was no mystery as far as how a microphone worked. But the idea of actually going directly to the string without having a microphone in the way of it just seemed like the way to go. And in their testing, it became clear rather quickly that this could be a good thing. So at this point, Adolf and George decided to split off and form their own company. The original company was called Rho Patent. No one quite knows what the Rho stands for, but patent was the idea that they could create a number of different inventions, a number of different ideas, and license them out to people, and patent, or as you say, patent, this particular idea, and then move on to the next idea. It was to be a patent mill, really. But a lot of people really liked the sound of the guitar, and George was out playing the guitar all the time. I guess you could say that George was he was an amateur musician, given that he had another job. Isn't that the difference? An amateur musician is one who has a second job. A professional musician is one whose wife works. think you could say he was an amateur musician, and he was pretty good. So anyway, it kept improving on the idea, but a lot of people were seeing this and saying, wow, I want one of those. So the original idea of rope patent changed slightly to making pickups, but only pickups. So you could bring your guitar into rope patent. Rope patent would install a pickup on your guitar, and then you could take it and have all the advantages of being heard over the rest of the band. Well, as we all know now, guitars come in every shape, size, and flavor, and they realized very quickly we sure have to come up with a shed load of designs to cover all of these different guitars out there. And we thought, well, let's just make some guitars. Well, they didn't exactly make them. They purchased guitar bodies from Harmony and a couple of other companies. I remember looking back through some of the old records, and back in 1931, they were buying K acoustic guitars to be able to convert into Rickenbacker electric guitars. It cost them $4. $4 to buy a guitar that they could convert. I'm not quite sure why, but somewhere along the way they decided to not purchase anymore and manufacture their own instruments. By this time, the company had changed its name. It was now called Electro String Instrument Corporation. I guess in 1931, that was supposed to sound, really high-tech, really sexy or something like that. Electro String Instrument Corporation was actually the manufacturer of Rickenbacker guitars all the way up into the 1960s. So it did, that part of the company did continue for quite a few years. Well, obviously one of the first things they needed to do was to get a patent on this device. The problem is that the U.S. Patent Office has one primary rule. Whatever your invention is, it has to work. That's just the first thing. You can't patent something that doesn't work. Otherwise, everyone that's invented a perpetual motion machine would have a patent. They didn't believe it would work. They just could not look at the application and agree that this is something that could conceivably work. So there was much writing back and forth between California and Washington, telling the patent commissioners that they were full of it. It does work very well, thank you. How about signing off on it? And for whatever reason, they just couldn't seem to get it done. Finally, Charlotte Rickenbacker, Adolph's wife, took the train from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and she took along with her a fellow by the name of Saul Hoopy. Saul Hoopy was another one of these vaudeville musicians that actually had some following. He was pretty well known. And he had been playing a Rickenbacker electric Hawaiian style guitar for quite a few years still at that point. She took him into the patent commissioner's office, and he played a 10-minute concert for them. At the end of the so-called hearing concert, they stamped the papers, and Charlotte and Saul came back to California with a patent in hand. Well, things took off pretty well, and they were making a lot of instruments at the factory on Western Avenue in Los Angeles. And I should actually go back to the very first guitar that they produced in this factory. Once they had a working pickup and they knew this was going to be an interesting thing, they decided, they produced a prototype body. And they told Harry Watson, their shop foreman, that they needed a body for this pickup as a prototype for the new Rickenbacker produced electric guitar. Not the ones that they were buying, but for the first Rickenbacker produced guitar. So he went to the back fence behind the building, pried a board off, and sawed the thing out and cut it into what's now known as the frying pan. Actually the original electric guitar. For those anoraks that really want to know the details, the wood was hemlock. And it was, and it is, still warped. The shape of the body was the shape of the body was just a little round thing, hence the name frying pan. But the neck itself was patterned after a Martin electric guitar, sort of V-shaped, kind of chunky, and probably, well, it isn't very comfortable. Let me put it that way. It isn't very comfortable as an electric guitar. It had a convertible nut and bridge so that it could be played as either a Hawaiian guitar, a lap steel guitar in your lap, but it is fretted and it could be played as a Spanish guitar. So when it finally went into production, they made the decision that maybe hemlock wasn't the best choice, so they cast it out of aluminum. And this was based again on Adolph's long experience working with materials, design engineering, all of this. So it's actually a hollow cast aluminum body that were the first true production Rickenbacker guitars. Now, they actually cast the frets right into the neck of the instrument, so it was a one-piece thing, kind of like I forgot the name of the guitar now, but years and years later, there was some plastic guitars that the frets were molded right into it. Well, this was back in the 1930s that they had come up with that concept. And then to satisfy the Spanish guitar players that really wanted a body to hang on to, they took a fairly traditional shaped acoustic body, created a little pocket on the front, lined it with foam, or not foam, but felt, and you could pop your frying pan guitar into this little felt holder, and you could hold it up like a Spanish guitar. Fairly clever. Personally, I've actually only seen one pretty famous guitar player, Alvino Ray, had one, and his was certainly within the first 5 instruments produced, and he had one that he used throughout his career. Well, time went on, and they were having some success, and you have to put in perspective, now in the mid-1930s, the real craze, the latest sound, the big hit music, at least in the U.S., was Hawaiian music. It's hard to imagine that, but that's what the market was. Everyone wanted to hear Hawaiian music. There were Hawaiian clubs everywhere. It was just the latest rage. So the electric guitar really took to its own as a Hawaiian guitar, not at all as a Spanish guitar. Every Hawaiian guitar player who wanted to be heard seemed like they owned a Rickenbacker. And the aluminum thing was working out moderately well. Aluminum, of course, expands and contracts with the heat, and so there probably were some tuning issues. I've certainly heard rumors of that. So Adolph, going back to his experience at Hot Point and his experience with Bakelite and injection molding, they started casting all of the guitars out of Bakelite plastic. For the most part, they're hollow. And some of the earlier hollow instruments They actually poured hot tar inside the neck to make them a little more solid. In later years, they stuffed them with newspapers. And still today, when some of these instruments turn out, the first thing people do is pull out some of the newspaper to try to put a date on the guitar. A number of different models were produced. They were made 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 string versions. There were double neck versions produced. They tried just about every combination of guitar they could. And they also experimented from the early days producing an upright electric bass and violin and cello and harps. The first upright electric basses and violins were made with an aluminum tube with a traditional neck affixed to them and a neck and fingerboard, and the strings then spanned from the wooden neck onto the aluminum tube body where the bridge and pickup were mounted. Once again, the old aluminum expansion gremlin crept into the picture, and they decided to switch to Bakelite in the case of the violin. If you've ever seen pictures of the Rickenbacker Bakelite violin, I hope you would agree with me, it's got to be about the most futuristic looking instrument you've ever seen. I think if there was such a thing as a Klingon violin, I think that would be it. The viola and cello were made in a similar way. The upright electric bass actually went back to cast iron. The entire body was cast iron, but it was mostly hollow. It was kind of in a loop type configuration. I think you have to look at one of the books to see what I'm talking about. But it worked quite well. I've always said, though, with an iron body on it, it would be great for heavy metal. But, we have one in the museum, and realistically, we needed a fairly large metal hoop contraption to hang the instrument on, because it's not something that you can really comfortably hold up all day or move around. As far as the harps, Harpo Marx was one of the people that had a Rickenbacker electric harp. For all I know, he may have been the only one, certainly the only one that I've ever seen. And they experimented with pianos and all kinds of things. I think anything with strings they probably tried at one time or another. I guess everybody wants to be louder, don't they? Well, everything was going fairly swimmingly until, this World War II thing kind of got in the way. And suddenly there wasn't a huge demand, or more accurately, there were other priorities. And the company did continue to produce a very few number of instruments during the war, but for the most part, Adolf Rickenbacker used his injection molding experience to make toothbrushes. And they also made a few precision mechanical devices and small motors and things I think they were used in bomb sites and stuff like that. I recently came across a letter written by Charlotte Rickenbacker to a general in Washington, D.C., who was overseeing the allocation of strategic materials during the war. And she was trying to obtain an allocation of copper wire because there was enough demand. Still, some people still wanted to buy electric guitars. And she was trying to get the copper to do it. I remember it was a fairly condescending letter, but he did concede that maybe somebody somewhere needed a guitar, and she was able to obtain a little bit of copper wire, and then they did produce a few more. Well, we're now coming up into the late 1940s. By this time, Adolf is looking forward to retirement. He doesn't have any relatives. I should have mentioned George Beecham. And that's the way George always wanted his name pronounced, Beecham. Most people would say Beauchamp if they were doing the French pronunciation, but he always called himself George Beecham. He was not well, he was a musician at heart, so I guess he didn't want to work that very hard. And he decided that he just wanted to fish for the rest of his life, and he left the company so he could go and fish. And I guess he did fish for a very short period of time before he died. That left Adolf with the company, and by this time Adolf was getting up there and was ready to retire. Adolf was incredibly successful. The guitar business was a very small part of his overall business. And he was the go-to tool and die guy in Los Angeles. Anyone wanted something really special and unique in precise metalwork, they went to Adolf. So that was a whole different part of his business. And long story short, he was living well and wanted to retire. I guess it didn't hurt that Charlotte Rickenbacker, his wife, was the heiress of the Standard Oil fortune. But he didn't have any children. So I'm going to come back to that part of the story and pick that up. Let's go back to 1946. My dad, F.C. Hall, he always wanted to be called F.C. because he really hated his first name of Francis. And he and I both hated our middle name of Carey. So he decided to call himself F.C. all the time. My dad had established an electronic parts distribution business. As a young man, he started building his own batteries, he was building his own radios, he got all kinds of contracts for radio repair services, PA repair installations and things like this. But the distribution side, which at that time, television was just coming in, people needed replacement. I say tubes, you say valves, capacitors, potentiometers, all of these components that radio supply, TV repair people needed. So he had created a company, and by 1946 he had 27 salespeople calling on clients all over California, Nevada, Arizona, Baja California, and Mexico, and they were selling a lot of electronic components. Well, one day his accountant brought him a statement from one customer who just consistently had a great deal of problems paying his bills. And this was a radio repair shop. And, he was always late. He just never could quite get caught up on his bills. My dad very regularly took his lunch not too far away from the guy's shop. So he said, well, I'll go down there and have a friendly chat with him and see if we can find out what's going on. Well, he did. He walked in the shop and talked with the fellow. They very quickly ascertained that it was Mrs. Fender's. It was Mrs. Fender that was taking the money out of Leo Fender's cash box. And they solved that problem and brought Leo up to date on his bill. But in the course of this, they got to talking, and my dad had seen these guitars in the back of the shop that Doc Kaufman and primarily Doc Kaufman and Leo were putting together just kind of on the side. It was a sideline to the radio repair business. But they had a couple of musicians that were buying these instruments and liking them. And my dad observed this, and being the entrepreneur that he was, he said, well, you know, Leo, I've got 27 salespeople out here. I know how to sell stuff. You seem to have an interesting product here. You don't know how to sell anything. So let me take the distribution. Let me be your partner. Long story short, from 1946 to 1953, my dad was the half owner of Fender. And I'll give you a little side story there before you come around. One of the first products that they came up with was called, as I'm sure you all know, the broadcaster. And unfortunately, that was a trademark by Gretsch used on their drums, and they very quickly got a cease and desist order for a broadcaster. And my dad had the assignment of writing the letter to Gretsch saying, "Oh, we're very sorry, we didn't know, we won't do it anymore." And the guitar, of course, became the so-called no-caster. Anyway, it was my dad that had to write that letter. Anyway, that business grew pretty rapidly, and a lot of guitars were being produced. And the way the company was organized was very similar to a lot of other companies. It was a tax dodge. Manufacturing companies didn't sell their product, at least not directly. Manufacturing companies sold their product to some type of a sales or distribution company, and then the distribution company would sell to the end customer. There was a Ford manufacturing company, and there was a Ford sales company. All of the bigger companies were organized in this way, and it was a way to save something like 20 or 30% on some taxes back then. Well, it was very similar. There was a Fender manufacturing company, and then my dad's company, which was called Radio and Television Equipment Company. And Radio TV was then the distributor for Fender guitars from 1946 to 1953. But this involved actually physically picking up loads of guitars each day and then taking them over to the warehouse at Radio Tel, as it was called. And my dad was telling me some issues were developing along the way. They had brought in some other salespeople that had given parts of the company to. And there were some issues developing. But one day, my dad made a phone call to Leo. I said, "Leo, the guitars that came over on today's load, did you check these out yourself?" "Yes, I sure did." "Okay. Was there any particular reason why you didn't put any coils in any of the pickups?" And it was problems like this. They were constantly frustrated. They were getting returns and a lot of different issues like that. So, kind of to protect himself, my dad had, I don't actually know how, somehow or other he'd come in contact with Adolf Rickenbacker, who was wanting to retire, and just to protect himself, he bought Rickenbacker. So for about 9 months in 1953, he was the half owner of Fender, and he was the whole owner of Rickenbacker. Well, you can imagine that probably didn't make Leo Fender terribly happy that my dad owned competitor. And long story short, they finally agreed to go their own separate ways. And most of the people that my dad had trained in radio and television went to the Fender Manufacturing Company so that they could create their own sales and distribution to add on to their manufacturing organization. Probably the best example was Don Randall. Don Randall became the president of Fender and was president of Fender all the way through to the CBS era. My dad had hired Don Randall out of high school to work in radio and TV, and was the warehouse manager for years and years. It's really a true statement, and it's never quite come out, but I'm pretty happy to mention it now. Fender would not exist today but for my dad. My dad put up the money, he put in the time, he came up with the idea of putting it into distribution. Leo was a great inventor, certainly not a guitar player, but he was a great inventor. He had some ideas. He just didn't know how to put it together as a business. My dad was also not a guitar player, but he did have a touch for business, and he knew what to do. They simply wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for his effort. Never mind that they didn't pay back the loan that he gave them. Fender still owes us about $100,000. Well, now, my dad had Rickenbacker, which was now totally dominating the Hawaiian guitar market, the electric lap steel market. That was a good thing because that's really what the market was. But early part of the 50s, and probably due to Leo Fender and some of his instruments, the market was beginning to change to Spanish-style guitars. And Rickenbacker had to compete. And so my dad brought in a young German luthier who had had some success in Germany, and whose dad had previously been a luthier for quite a few years at Gibson in Kalamazoo. This was Roger Rossmeisel. And Roger Rossmeisel was classically trained in building guitars. There's a lot of stories as to where he learned to build his classical instruments and all that. And it's really hard to say what's true. Supposedly he was trained at the Mittenwald School, which is a several hundred-year-old school that taught violins and cellos and instruments like that. I'm not sure whether that's actually true now from some more research that's come about. But if you look back in those 1950s designs, you'll see so many little details that look like they came from classical instruments, especially that German carve on the top. It's a negative carve on the front of the instrument. We still have that on the Model 381. That's something that's continued through. It's safe to say Roger Rossmeisel was the father of our modern electric guitars. There's so many little details. The shape of the body, shape of the head, the shape of the inlay. The inlay was originally rectangular, except that it was in two colors. It was a white pearl and a black pearl on the diagonal. The thing is, you couldn't really see the black pearl, so from a distance it looked like just a little sharp fin inlay, and that was abbreviated years later. But it came back. It came from that original design. Time went on. Rickenbacker was making more and more Spanish electric guitars. Things were moving along pretty well. And I think Fender was probably moving a little faster than we were, but nevertheless, the company was doing all right. Then all of a sudden, this band, I think came from down the road here somewhere, showed up, and March 1964, my dad traveled to New York City as the Beatles landed. And he set up a display for them in his hotel, in the Savoy Hotel. And he had several instruments laid out. This had been arranged with Brian Epstein. And when the guys got there and had a few days to rest, they came over to my dad's hotel. They were staying in the Plaza Hotel. My dad had the display set up in the Savoy Hotel. And they came over, minus George. George was sick. He was in bed. He had a cold. And even Ringo showed up. And Cynthia Lennon also came along. My mom was there, Brian Epstein, and a few other people. Well, John, of course, had already been using one of our instruments since 1959. So, he was excited. And my dad had planned ahead and had a brand new Model 325 for John to try, and he loved it, and he went home with that. He also had the 360-12, the 12-string electric, and Paul and John played this guitar. That was a pretty cool thing. The first thing they said is, George would really like this guitar. This is right up his alley. This would be just the kind of thing that he'd like to have. But he's sick. He's over at the other hotel. We said, well, let's go over there. Let's just take it over there and let's show it to him. Well, the problem was all of the girls that had been surrounding the Plaza Hotel were now surrounding the Savoy Hotel. And the logistics of trying to figure out how to get him back to the Plaza were it was an issue. My dad talked with the bellman in the hotel. It turned out there was a little private service tunnel of some kind that left the Savoy Hotel, went out, and came out in Central Park. So my dad, my mom, the Beatles, minus George, and the rest of the Beatles entourage walked across Central Park in broad daylight, not a single fan in sight, carrying the 360-12 to George. Walked in the front door of the Plaza, and no one was the wise ball, they were still all over at the Savoy. George sat up in bed, he played the guitar, he loved it. He actually did a radio interview by telephone while he was playing the guitar, and they said, well, what's that sound we hear? He said, oh, this is something new. This is a Rickenbacker 12-string guitar. And long story short, George went home with that guitar. Now, of course, my dad wanted to complete the edition with Paul playing the Rickenbacker bass. Nobody told my dad that Paul was left-handed. So he bought a right-handed bass. And Paul looked at it and played it. Oh, that's nice, but I'm left-handed. So that was kind of the end of that. Well, I think the rest is pretty well known to you as far as how the 12-string guitar showed up and how how Rickenbacker certainly flourished and thrived from the association with the Beatles. The only thing I'll add is that a year later, in 1965, they played the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. And I was 15 years old. My dad took me along, and I got to present Paul with his first Rickenbacker bass. And I sat, this was actually in Burt Lancaster's house. They had rented his house while they were staying there. I was sitting in Burt Lancaster's living room, listening to the 3 guitar-playing Beatles plugged into one little tiny amplifier, a private concert. And not too many 15-year-olds that had that experience, I can tell you. I took over from my dad in 1984, and I pretty well took the same vow that my dad did, which is I will not produce Rickenbacker products anywhere but in the U.S. and more specifically California. Yeah, there's 1 or 2 components on there that aren't from the U.S. It turns out the U.S. just simply doesn't make capacitors anymore. Those come from overseas. And then there's the problem of key lines. All of the so-called American key line makers, for the most part, produce their keys in Taiwan or Korea. So we condescended and decided German keys would be okay. And we've been using the Schaller keys pretty much since I've taken over. And I've kept the production there. I'm not interested in trading quality for quantity. I'm really only interested in producing the best that we can. And that's limited to supply as a result. If I had a big factory in China, I could stamp them out by the millions and probably sell them for a little bit less. But I really don't want to do that because that is not the history that George Beecham and Adolf Rickenbacker established for our company. Thank you for listening to all that. I will let the band give you something